Hello.
Can ASHWALLOW the Unbroken. Book 1, The First Roads. Preface. This is a story about a young Tauren who left home before he was ready and became ready on the road. It is not a story about the greatest hunter who ever walked Azeroth, or the most powerful, or the most celebrated. Can ASHWALLOW does not slay warlords or turn the tide of wars. He fixes wounds, tends animals, helps strangers, and moves on. His victories are mostly quiet ones, a beast that chooses to trust, a bleeding that stops, a fire kept through a long night for someone who needed it kept. He has one broken horn and 2 companions that most people would consider unlikely. One is white as morning fog and moves like weather. The other sounds like something that should have died years ago and decided not to. Between them walks a young Tauren who was born with red eyes in a small camp on the Mulgore plains and has been trying to understand what that means ever since. What follows is the story of his roads, the ones that made him before he knew he was being made, the ones that broke things and proved that breaking is not ending. He walks 2 continents in the course of them, and what he takes from them is smaller and harder than what he went looking for, that a hand offered costs nothing. These pages do not contain everything that happened to him. They contain what mattered, which is a different and smaller list. A ridge in southern Mulgore, watched for 14 mornings. A plank extending over a very long drop in 1,000 needles. A fire in a marsh at night, between 2 people who could not speak a word to each other. A word about the world this story inhabits. Azeroth is a world at war with itself, and with things from beyond itself, a world of extraordinary beauty and serious ongoing damage. A world where the categories that are supposed to organize everything, horde and alliance, friend and enemy, us and them, turn out on close examination to be less stable than advertised. Can moves through this world without much patience for those categories. He helps people. He does not ask which side they are on first. This is not naivety. He has been in enough dangerous places to have lost naivety thoroughly and early. It is a position, arrived at through observation and held with the quiet stubbornness at the core of who he is. He will not be thanked for it every time. He does not appear to require that. The road continues east. That is enough to know. That is the condition of all worthwhile travel and of all worthwhile stories. Written in the tradition of those who carry stories so they are not lost. Acknowledgments. This story would not exist without a world worth telling stories about. That world was built by the hands and imagination of the people at Blizzard Entertainment who created Azeroth, who placed a Kodo graveyard in the grey silence of Desolace, who put a wooden plank on a cliff edge in 1,000 needles, and trusted that someone would eventually stand at the end of it and feel something real, who gave the wild places of that world beasts worth a hunter's patience, and made the patience the point. The world they made is large enough to live a life in, and Can is proof of that. This story would not exist without the hunters. Not the hunters of Thunder Bluff, though they matter too, but the players who sat down at their keyboards across years and decades and chose to walk Azeroth as beast masters, who understood instinctively that the bond between a hunter and a companion was a covenant rather than a convenience, who named their pets with care and mourned them when they were gone, and understood that the naming mattered. Every beast master who ever waited days for one animal and felt the singular essence of the moment it finally came, contributed something to how this story understands itself. This story would not exist without the hardcore community. Hardcore changes everything. When a character can die permanently, the world becomes real in a way that ordinary play cannot quite reach. Every crossing of a dangerous zone, every difficult encounter, every decision to help a stranger rather than move on, these carry actual weight. Can's story is a hardcore story not because death follows him everywhere, but because the possibility of it makes each choice matter. The hardcore community of classic World of Warcraft era understood this and built something around it. A culture of genuine care, of real stakes, of characters whose stories end and are therefore worth telling while they continue. This story would not exist without the small moments. A fisherman on an island, working with the patience of someone who has made peace with time. A surgeon in a border outpost who says stay a month without warmth and means it completely. The unnamed guards and travelers and fire sitters across 2 continents who gave one piece of something they knew to someone passing through, and did not wait to see what the piece became. These small moments are the architecture of a life and the architecture of this story, and they belong to a world detailed enough to contain them. The road continues. We are grateful it does, with thanks to everyone who walked any part of it. Dedication. For every soul that walked Azeroth with purpose and did not make it to the next sunrise. You were not lost. You were complete. Part 1, Red Eyes at Dawn. The plains of Mulgore do not welcome weakness. They test everything that walks them. The grass itself grows sharp enough to cut if you move through it carelessly. The winds carry cold long after spring has announced itself on the calendar of the seasons. And the sky sits so wide and open above that a young calf can feel swallowed whole by the sheer indifference of it. The land does not hate you. It simply does not care whether you are equal to it or not. That distinction, Can would come to understand over the years that followed, was one of the most important things Mulgore ever offered, and it offered it without preamble and without concern for whether the student was ready. It was into this vast, beautiful, indifferent world that Can was born, on a night when the stars burned unusually red, and the elder women of the village exchanged quiet looks over the newborn's face. His eyes were wrong. Every Tauren child born in Camp Narache came into the world with the expected browns and ambers of their people. Warm colours, earth colours, the colours of the land that had shaped the Tauren over uncounted generations of walking it and working it, and listening to what it said in the language of weather and stone, and the behaviour of animals. The settlement itself embodied those colours in every feature. Perhaps 30 families occupying a fold in the southwestern reaches of Mulgore, where the hills softened into grazing land, where red stone formations rose from the earth like the knuckles of something ancient, half-buried and endlessly patient, where the communal fires at evening cast amber light across hide-covered structures and totem poles, carved with the faces of ancestors who watched the living with the calm of those who had already resolved all the questions the living were still working through. Camp Narache smelled of cook fires and cured leather, and the sweetness of trampled grass warming in the afternoon sun. It was a place that had been lived in for a long time by people who had learned, through the accumulation of generations, exactly how to live in it. Can arrived into all of this with eyes the deep crimson of cooling embers, and the elder shaman Musapor spent 3 days in quiet contemplation before declaring the child simply marked by the Earth Mother, touched in a way that would reveal its meaning in time, when the meaning was ready to be read. He said it with the measured certainty of a man who had spent his life reading signs, and knew both the value and the limits of that skill. Those who knew him well enough noticed that he said nothing beyond what he said, and that the nothing beyond was itself a kind of statement. His mother, ASHWALLOW, accepted the declaration without visible concern. She was a broad-shouldered woman of middle years, not tall for a Tauren, but built with the solid, unhurried permanence of someone who had decided long ago what she was, and had been consistently that thing ever since, without tumult and without revision. Her hands were the most expressive thing about her, large and calloused and precise, permanently stained at the creases from years of working tannin into hide. The skin there a shade darker than the rest of her, as if the leather had left some of itself behind as payment for all the years she had given it. She could assess the grain of a hide by touch alone in poor light. She could read the weather by the way air moved across the back of her neck. She tanned leather, traded with passing caravans, and raised her son largely alone after his father, a scout named Duro, walked east into the Barrens on a ranging mission and did not return. Can was 2 years old when Duro disappeared. No body was found. No message came. No traveller through the crossroads brought word of a Tauren scout on the eastern road. ASHWALLOW walked into the Barrens, and the Barrens received him in the way it received everything, without comment, without explanation, without the courtesy of a conclusion. Sira waited the appropriate seasons, and then stopped waiting in the private way that people stop waiting when they have accepted something without announcing the acceptance. She kept his bow on the wall of their dwelling. She did not take it down, and she did not speak of it, and Can grew up looking at it with the quiet intensity of someone circling something he did not yet have words for. He grew up with an empty place at the fire that nobody named aloud, and everybody understood. Camp Narache was not a warrior settlement. It had no barracks, no formal training ground, no tradition of sending its young people out to prove themselves through organized combat. It was a village of craftspeople and patient, unhurried lives, leatherworkers whose finished goods found buyers as far as Thunder Bluff and the crossroads, fishers who worked the cold rivers in the grey of early morning, cooks who could build a nourishing meal from ingredients that would defeat a less observant person entirely. The elders carried the old stories with the attention of people who understood that stories were a form of medicine, precise and potent, distributed accordingly. The settlement was alive with noise from before dawn until well after dark. Children chased each other between the structures with the focused energy of creatures whose primary occupation was motion. Hunters returning from the hills shared their accounts with anyone who would listen, and plenty of people would listen, and the accounts grew with each retelling in the way of things that were fundamentally true and merely needed room to develop. Craftspeople argued amiably about technique and materials. The communal fire at evening drew everyone who did not have somewhere else to be, and the conversations that arose there moved through topics with the unself-conscious freedom of people who had known each other all their lives, and felt no obligation to stay on any single subject, longer than it held their interest. Into all of this noise, Can was born silent. Not literally, he cried as an infant with perfectly ordinary volume, and spoke as a calf with reasonable frequency. But there was something about his presence in any gathering that was different from everyone around him, a stillness that was not passivity, and not shyness, and not the careful watchfulness of someone unsure of their standing. It was simply that he listened more than he spoke, observed more than he performed, and was entirely comfortable with the space between observation and response, a space that most of the people around him filled immediately and instinctively with more words. The village elders called him the Still One with a mixture of affection and a faint unease they would have struggled to fully articulate. Even as a young calf, Can had a completeness in himself that made the company of others feel optional rather than necessary, not because he was cold or indifferent to people, but because he found the world sufficiently interesting on its own terms that the additional layer of social performance that most gatherings required felt like interference rather than addition. He was at the river before dawn most mornings, sitting on a flat stone at the bank's edge, in positions that would have made most calves fidget within minutes. He stayed until the light was full, and the fish had begun their daily business, and he had learned whatever there was to learn from watching them. He ranged into the southern hills for hours, without telling anyone where he was going, and came back with observations that he offered carefully, aware they were not always welcome in conversations that had moved on to other subjects, while he had been elsewhere learning things nobody had asked him to learn. His mother watched all of this with the pragmatic acceptance of a woman who had been watching its arrival since long before it became visible. She did not worry about it. She had her own assessment of her son and trusted it. His closest companion in those years, perhaps the only person who fully understood what they were getting into and chose it anyway, was a young Tauren female 2 years his junior named Tamer. She arrived at his river stone when she was 7 and he was 9, on a morning in late summer when the light was still amber and the air carried the last of the night's cool. She came across the grass from the settlement's edge with the purposeful stride of someone who had decided to be somewhere and saw no reason to announce the deciding in advance, sat down beside him without fuss or permission, and looked at the water. She lasted approximately 4 minutes before she said, "You have been staring at that same spot since I got here. There is nothing happening in that spot. The fish are over there, behind the rock on the left, 3 of them, and they have been watching you watch the wrong place for at least as long as I have been sitting here." Can looked at the rock on the left. There were indeed 3 fish behind it, hovering in the slow eddy where the current broke around the stone's upstream face. "I know," he said. "I have been watching the current pattern. The fish will move when the pattern changes." "When will it change?" "When the sun reaches that angle," he said, pointing to a spot on the eastern bank where the light would eventually strike the water differently. "Another hour, perhaps." Tamer considered this with the focus she brought to problems that genuinely interested her, which was most problems. "So you are not watching the fish," she said. "You are watching the water, so you will know where the fish will be before they know they will be there." "Yes." She fell silent for a moment, a genuinely rare occurrence, as Can would come to understand. Then she said, with the directness that never once softened across all the years he knew her, "That is the cleverest fishing I have ever heard of, and I want you to teach me everything you know." He looked at her. She looked back with complete confidence, as if the possibility that he might decline was not something she had allocated any space for in her planning. He said, "It requires being very still and very quiet for a long time." "I know," she said. "You are neither of those things." She considered this with evident interest rather than offense. "That is true," she said. "But I am very patient when I want something. Those are different." He opened his mouth to explain why they were not, in fact, different in the relevant ways, and she said, "Also, you are the most interesting person in Camp Narache, and you never talk to anyone, which means you are wasting interesting things, and I intend to fix that." He closed his mouth. She stayed until the sun reached the angle he had indicated, and the fish moved precisely as he had predicted, and she asked questions throughout that hour at a rate that would have driven most people to distraction, and which Can found, to his own surprise, not distracting at all. Her questions were carefully framed and pointed, and revealed a mind that moved quickly and wanted to understand things rather than merely know them, which was different, and which he found he respected. She was spectacularly bad at being still. She managed perhaps 6 minutes at a stretch before some thought or observation became so pressing that it had to be released into the air regardless of the fish. She never learned to be still at the river. She came back every morning for 2 weeks trying, failing with increasing creativity, then abandoned the project with the honest pragmatism of someone who had genuinely attempted a thing and found it contrary to her fundamental nature. But she kept coming anyway because Can was there and she had made her assessment. What Tamer brought to his life was a kind of company he had not previously known to be possible, presence that did not require him to perform anything, that received his observations with the genuine interest of someone who found the world endlessly fascinating and wanted more angles on it. She had an extraordinary capacity for saying true things plainly, the kind of things that most people recognized as true only after they had been said, and spent some time sitting with the recognition. She talked about everything. The way the red stone formations in the hills to the south looked different at different times of day, and what that suggested about light and stone, and whether things changed or only how we saw them changed. The strange injustice of adults expecting children to listen carefully when adults rarely listened carefully to each other. The fact that Musipur always knew things before he was told them, and nobody talked about this even though everyone had noticed it. The question of why her mother cried sometimes when she was cooking, quietly, when she thought no one was watching, and whether it was right to pretend not to have seen it or whether pretending was a kind of lying. Can listened to all of it with the focused attention he gave to things that interested him, which Tamer always did, and offered responses when a response added something, and was quiet when quiet was the better contribution. She had told him once early in their acquaintance that he was the only person she knew who listened, as if what she was saying actually mattered, rather than as if he was waiting for his turn to speak. He had not known what to say to this, so he had said nothing, which she had apparently understood as the correct response because she had nodded as if something had been confirmed. She was 8 when she said the thing about Duro's bow. Can had been looking at it, the bow on the wall of his family's dwelling, which he was passing on his way to the river, with the attention he gave it sometimes, the kind of looking that was really a kind of asking. Tamer was beside him and saw the looking and said, without preamble or softening, "You think about your father more than you let on." He looked at her. "Everyone can see it," she said, not unkindly. "When you look at that bow, you go somewhere else. Your body stays, but your eyes go to a different place. You notice a great deal," he said. "Everyone notices," she said. "Nobody says it because they think it will hurt you. I think not saying it hurts you more, because then you have to carry it alone." She looked at the bow for a moment. He walked east. Nobody knows what happened. Those are two different things, the walking east and the not knowing. You cannot do anything about the walking east. But not knowing is something that could change. He went still, the way he always went still when something landed with more weight than he'd prepared for. Someday Tamer said, "You will go find out." And then, before he could respond, "Come on, we will miss the morning light," and she was already heading toward the river, and he followed, and neither of them said anything more about it that morning. But he thought about it for a long time after. He was 10 when his mother began his formal instruction in first aid. Not the ceremonial healing arts that belonged to the shamans, those were their own discipline, but the direct, field-applicable knowledge of a woman who lived at distance from any healer more skilled than herself, and had made an honest accounting of what that distance meant for anyone in her care. She began with a dead plainstrider she had skinned for leather, and used the carcass to show him what existed beneath a living creature's surface. She was matter-of-fact about it in the way that people who work with bodies are matter-of-fact, naming things by their proper names, watching his face to make sure the names were landing rather than passing by, correcting his attention when it drifted to the less important details. "Major vessels," she said, pointing. "Learn where they run. Learn what happens when they are compromised, and what you can do about it in a field with limited materials and no assistance." She showed him the kit she kept assembled. Clean cloth strips wound tight and treated. Plant resin preparations she had developed through years of careful testing. Wood shaped for splinting. Defined pressure points on limbs. The sequence, this above everything, the sequence. Stop the bleeding first, then clean, then close, then stabilize. "Most people get it wrong," she said. "They go to what looks most alarming. A terrible-looking wound that is not bleeding badly can wait. Bleeding that is quiet and looks manageable will kill you while you attend to the thing that looks dramatic. Learn the sequence and trust the sequence, even when your eyes are telling you something different." She made him practice until his hands knew it without requiring his mind to direct them. She used her own occasional injuries from leatherwork as teaching opportunities, having him treat the wound while she observed and corrected. When he came home with his own injuries, which a calf ranging into the hills acquired with reliable regularity, she watched him treat them himself and said nothing unless the technique was wrong. "A hunter who cannot care for himself," she said once, looking at his hands rather than his face in the way she had when she was saying something she considered important, "becomes a burden to everything that depends on him." He understood the practical meaning immediately. The fuller meaning that maintaining your own capability was a form of respect for what depended on you, took years of living to fully unfold. His horn broke when he was 12. The details were ordinary and slightly embarrassing by the standards of epic injury. He had been following the river course north of the settlement, moving along the bank where the current carved interesting patterns in the shallows, pursuing the kind of observation that had no practical value he could articulate, and which he followed for its own sake, with the contentment of someone who had never felt the need to justify curiosity. The stone he stepped on looked solid from above, which is one of the small consistent deceptions of wet riverbank terrain. The angle of his boot caught the stone's surface wrong. He went down fast and hard, the right horn connecting with the embedded rock at the bank's edge, with a crack that he felt in his skull before he heard it outside his head. He lay still for a moment, the cold water soaking into his clothes, the pain arriving in its different registers. First the sharp impact shock, then the deeper persistent ache, then the specific wrongness that told him the damage was structural. He assessed methodically as his mother had taught him. Then he pushed himself up and sat on the bank and looked at the break. It was not clean. The horn had fractured rather than snapped, leaving a surface that was rough and uneven, small shards of dense bone still clinging to the main break, the exposed interior a different color from the outer surface. He cleaned the wound with the river water and applied what he carried and walked back to Camp Narache. His mother looked at the break without expression for a long moment. Then she got her tools and sat him down and began the work of making the break acceptable, filing the rough edges smooth, working the fragments free with the careful precision she brought to all delicate tasks, treating the exposed surface until what remained was clean and finished, a stub that began just above where the horn would have curved and ended in a flat angled plane. She worked with the care she brought to all materials, and Can sat still through it, which was not entirely easy. When she had finished, she looked at her work with the appraising attention she gave finished pieces. "The village healer," she said, "will confirm what I am about to tell you. This will not grow back." "I know," he said. She looked at him for a moment, reading his face with the directness she brought to that certain kind of looking. Then she nodded once and began putting her tools away. The village healer confirmed it the following morning. The break was permanent. What remained was what would remain. The elders murmured, as elders do when the world delivers something that admits of interpretation. A broken horn carried specific weight in Tauren tradition. It spoke of paths interrupted, of journeys that would not reach their natural form, of something diverted from its original direction. Some read it as ill omen. Others as simply what it was, a young calf who had slipped on a wet stone. The settlement divided quietly along the lines that settlements always divide along when something happens that cannot be definitively read one way or the other. Musapor said nothing for 3 days. Then he drew Sira aside privately and spoke with the careful, measured language he used for things he considered important. Her son's story, he said, was not yet ready to be read. The meaning was in the living, not the break. He said this with the certainty of someone who had spent his life reading signs and knew the difference between a sign that was speaking and a sign that was still gathering what it had to say. Sira thanked him the way she answered everything briefly and returned to her work. She had her own assessment of her son and trusted it more than she trusted omens. The morning after the horn broke, Tamer arrived at the river stone before him, which had never happened before. She was sitting with her feet tucked under her, looking at the water with an unusual concentration that suggested she had been thinking rather than observing. When he sat beside her, she looked at him, at the broken stub of the right horn at his face, with the direct attention she brought to things that mattered to her. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "Not much now." She nodded. She looked at the stub for another moment, with an expression that moved through several things quickly before settling. "I have been thinking about it since yesterday," she said. "I think most people are going to see the break first. They will look at the short one and feel sorry for you or feel worried about what it means, and miss the whole rest of you entirely." She paused and then added with the complete absence of self-consciousness that was one of her most consistent qualities. "But I think the long one and the broken one together say something true that neither one says alone. The long one is what you are reaching toward. The broken one is what you have already come through. I think most people only get one story written on their face. You already have 2 and you are 12. He sat with this for a time, watching the water. Finally he said, "I slipped on a wet stone." "I know," she said. "But the horn does not." She stood and brushed grass from her clothes, brisk now, done with the moment. "Are you going to fish or sit there looking thoughtful? Because I can come back if you need more time to think about the wet stone." He looked up at her. "Stay," he said. She sat back down, and they fished until the sun was high, and neither of them said anything more about the horn that morning, and the settlement went about its business around them in all its ordinary noise and life. His mother taught him the weapons. Not formally, she was not a weapons instructor, but practically in the way she taught everything, by doing things in his presence and creating space for him to watch and ask and attempt. She had kept Juro's one-handed axe alongside his bow, and when Can was old enough to hold it without the weight being purely theoretical, she showed him the basics. Grip, balance, the difference between a swing that used only the arm and a swing that used the whole body turning behind it, which was the difference between effort and force. She showed him the staff work that every Tauren learned from childhood, how to use the length, how to control distance, how to make something that was fundamentally a walking implement into something that could stop an aggressive animal or buy time until a better option presented itself. He took to both with the same methodical attention he gave everything, practicing alone in the hills during his ranging, developing the strength that the tools demanded and the coordination that the techniques required. He was strong, genuinely, naturally strong in the way of young Tauren males who spent their days moving through terrain. But strength without technique was, as his mother demonstrated clearly on the one occasion, she showed him what technique could do against strength, insufficient. He had never used a gun. They were not common in Camp Narache. The settlement had little need for ranged weaponry beyond the basics, and the basics were staves and axes. He knew what guns were. He had seen one on the belt of a passing trader 3 years before, and had looked at it with the attention he gave all unfamiliar things, stored what he observed, and returned to it occasionally the way he returned to anything that hadn't yet finished telling him what it meant. He did not know yet that the gun would become the beginning of a great deal. He learned to cook from the settlement's most experienced cook, an older female hunter named Roke, who had spent 40 years feeding herself in the field, and had opinions about it that she delivered without invitation to anyone who showed genuine interest. She saw his interest, the systematic interest of someone who had identified food as a variable that could be studied and improved, and took him on with the frankness of someone who expected the student to meet the instruction halfway. He learned not just preparations but principles, what different methods did to the value of a material, how certain combinations produced effects on the body beyond basic sustenance, a meal that sharpened the senses for a morning's tracking, a preparation that sustained hard physical work over a long cold day. Roke had opinions about all of it and shared them freely, and he listened and asked questions and came back the following day with results for her to evaluate. He learned to sell what he made. The hides he produced beyond his own needs, the leather pieces he crafted in the evenings, the fish he caught beyond what the settlement required. Travelers through Camp Narache paid for useful things, and he learned quickly which useful things they valued most. He kept careful account of what he earned and what the earning enabled, because this too was a form of observation, the practical arithmetic of a traveling life, learned early in the safety of a home he had not yet left. He was 15 when the first real fight came to him. Not a hunting was familiar and managed. A fight, two larger calves from the settlement's northern side who had decided, with the reasoning available to adolescents who had not yet had their certainties tested, that the quiet one who went to the river alone and rarely spoke at communal gatherings must be somehow soft. They found him alone in the hill country south of the settlement in the late afternoon, and the confrontation had the brief, ugly directness of something that was going to happen regardless of what either party said. Can did not speak much. He used his staff, the walking staff he carried on all his ranging, the one he had been practicing with alone in the hills for 2 years. Not with any artistry, but with the solid, grounded effectiveness of someone who had been thinking carefully about how a body moved through space, and what it needed to do to remain upright when something wanted it not to be. The confrontation ended in approximately 4 minutes, with both larger calves reassessing their understanding of quiet. He came home and treated the bruises along his left forearm, and the cut above his ear with the methodical attention his mother had taught him. Sarah looked at the treatment when he finished, and then looked at his face. "Two," she said. It was not a question. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "Then your technique with the staff is adequate. We will work on it." This was, he would reflect later, one of the more purely Tauren responses to a fight he had ever encountered. From the thoughts of Can ASHWALLOW.
I have been asked what it is like to be the quiet one in a noisy world. The question assumes that silence is a condition imposed from the outside, like weather. It is not. The world makes all the sounds it has always made. I simply find that I hear more of them when I am not adding to them. Camp Narache is loud. Not unpleasantly, the noise of a living settlement is the sound of things working, and working is not unpleasant to listen to. The children, the craftspeople, the evening fire where everyone who has anything to say says it, and everyone who wants to listen listens. Moosepaw is quiet, and some of the oldest hunters share his stillness, but this is the exception. Most of the people I have grown up among are fully, freely, normally present in the world in the way that expressive people are present, loudly, visibly, without reservation. Tama most of all. She has no reservations. She says the things that everyone is thinking and nobody is saying because they have decided not to say them. And she says them with the bright confidence of someone who finds the cost of honesty much lower than the cost of its absence. She told me once that most people were afraid of saying true things because they were afraid of what would happen after. She said she had tried being afraid of that once and had found it made everything worse, so she had stopped. My horn is broken. Tama says it already carries 2 stories. I am still deciding what the second story is. Perhaps the deciding is itself part of the answer. The bow on the wall is my father's. I look at it sometimes with a kind of looking that is really a kind of asking. I do not yet know what I will do with the question, but I notice that I cannot stop asking it. Can ASHWALLOW